Hey guys, Jeremy here, Simple Little Life. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a very simple leather sheath. Now, this sheath is a bit of a mulligan for me. The first one that I made, I forgot to put the welt in it. And what's the welt, you ask? We'll get to that part in a minute. So first, let's talk about design. All I like to do is take the knife that I want the sheath for, kind of lay it on a piece of paper, and draw out the rough shape that's going to work accordingly. So this is basically our template. We're going to make a template out of paper, make sure this part is done correctly and that it's the right size and everything before we get to working on leather. A lot cheaper to ruin a bunch of paper than ruin a bunch of leather. So now we take our template, we're going to set it on the leather and just kind of trace it out. And from there, we're going to cut it all out. I just use razor knives, X-Acto knives, whatever you have around. And we're just going to kind of cut this template. And again, cutting it to the exact size of the paper that we had, because that paper we have proven to be a good size for our knife. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark a line right down the center, and this is going to be where the two halves of the sheath will fold. The reason I want this line is because I need to take some of that material out so that we can get a nice tight fit there. To do that, I'm actually just using some wood carving tools. These are actually my kids' like carving chisels, and I just kind of run them down there. They make special tools for this. I don't have them, but this works just as well. And then once I've done that, I'm also going to take this little razor scraper type thingy and kind of trim some of that excess. Again, we just want that material gone so we get a nice crisp fold. Don't go too thin because you don't want to be cutting through and ruining the strength and the thickness of the leather, but we just need some of that material out of the way so we can fold it over properly. Now I'm just going to cut out a piece of leather, and this will be what we cut the welt from. So the welt is basically a piece of leather that goes in between the two pieces that fold together, and essentially just protects the stitching so that the blade of the knife is actually touching the leather and not the stitching. You kind of see how the welt works there? Just gave it a test fit up, looks good to me. Alright, let's put the welt aside for a minute. The next part of the process is going to be figuring out this here belt loop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a square stitch pattern to secure the belt loop to the sheath, and to do that I kind of fold it over, get it roughly where I want, and then I'm going to mark out kind of where the stitch lines are going to go. Once I've got that marked out, I'm going to use this special tool. This is a marking tool, and it's got a little guide bar on there, and that just helps you get nice straight lines to the edge of the leather. And there's also a separate cutter for this too. So first thing I like to do is mark out the lines with the little groove, and this basically just, it does that. It puts like an impression groove in there, so you can kind of see how it's going to look. And then I'll change it out to this cutting tip, and the cutting tip, as you see right there, it's really nice and sharp, and it cuts really great little grooves so that we can bury the stitches flush with the leather so they don't stick proud. Now we've got some nice grooves for our stitches to lay into. The next thing I'll do is I'll kind of mark out a little landing place for the contact cement. The reason for that is that contact cement doesn't take dye like the rest of leather does, so I don't want any contact cement squeezing past the edges of the leather that will be visible. So I just mark a little box there, and I try to keep all my contact cement in that little box so that we don't have any squeeze out, and so that the dye will take to all the visible parts of the sheath. So we're going to fold over the belt loop, clamp it in the vise, and we'll let it dry. Alright, now that that's dry, we need to lay out our stitching holes, and to do that I've got this stitching wheel hole layout tool thing. Basically it's like a wheel with a bunch of spikes. You kind of run it along in the groove there, and that way you ensure to get nice and evenly spaced stitches. Works really well. Now we've got those marked, we can drill them on out. Use as small of a bit as possible. Now we can see the holes on the inside of the sheath. I'm going to go ahead and use that stitch grooving tool and put grooves on the inside of the sheath as well. The reason for that is that we obviously don't want the blade to cut into the stitching, or we don't even want the stitching rubbing against the blade and possibly marking it up. Now we're going to grab out the stitching pony. This is actually a stitching pony I made. I've got a video on that. Maybe I'll leave a link up in the corner for you if you want to check out that video. So here's a really cool tip. Take your tag end once you've threaded it through the needle and make it a little bit longer than the needle itself. And then we're going to grab the live end here, the long end, the working end, and we'll kind of take the needle and puncture it right in the middle there and just kind of run it down along. Run it down along like that so we get this loop. Then we'll take our tag end, stick it through that loop, and then pull the live end while keeping the tag end in there, and then kind of pull everything nice and snug. And what that does is it kind of secures those two lines together without a knot. So it's still thin enough to get through the holes, but it holds well enough that when you're yanking on it, your thread isn't going to come out of your needle. So we're going to be doing a saddle stitch here, and we're going to have a needle on each end of the thread. You pick whichever hole you'd like to start in, you run your thread through there, kind of even it up so you've got an even length on both sides. Pick your next hole, stick one needle through it, pull that kind of snug, and then put the other needle through that exact same hole. Pull it nice and tight and move on to the next hole, and that is basically a saddle stitch. This is a very easy way to sew leather. And I'm using a waxed thread that's specifically designed for leather. You can get this stuff colored, and obviously helps to use the right color, so we're going to dye the sheath black when we're all done with it, and we're using a black thread. Ba-boom, just like that, we've got our belt loop stitched together. We're going to make a quick template of our welt, and I'll kind of show you why in just a moment. So we're going to trace out the welt on the inside of the sheath, just so that we have a line to make sure we don't glue past. We don't really want to get any glue on the inside of the sheath. And then we'll put contact cement on both sides of the leather, position it how we want it to be, and then clamp it and let that dry. So while that's drying, let's cut out the template that we traced from the welt. So the first use for this template is going to be mark out the other side of the sheath to give ourselves that glue line again. And once that's done, we'll put our contact cement again on both sides of the leather, fold it over, and this is like the commitment zone. This is the sheath folded together. This is the cool part. Looks like a sandwich. Alright, we got that clamped up. We're going to let that dry. I'm going to trim off a little bit of excess here just to clean things up a little bit. This isn't the final trimming, but before I get into stitching, again, I'm going to use my saddle stitch grooving tool and marking tool. I will make sure I don't have any leather sticking out so that that guide bar is going to give me a true representation of the leather. So mark out all our grooves here, front and back. And then once that's done, we'll switch it up to the groove cutting tool. And then we'll cut our thread grooves on both sides of the sheath. Just like that. So I can use that template so we can figure out where the welt ends on the inside of the sheath. The reason for that is I want to put a stitching groove that's going to go right to the edge of the inside part of the welt. Now I'm going to take a French curve and use that as a very rigid guide that I can use to run my groove cutter along. That way I'll get a really nice, consistent, even curve for the second stitching groove. Again, we use our hole spacing wheel and kind of mark that all out. Now I'm not going to mark the back side because obviously we're just drilling through the front side. So we'll put that in the drill press and we'll go ahead and drill all these holes out. One thing to note is I only did the curve groove on the front of the sheath. Once we drill all our holes, we'll go back and clean that up. Okay, so now we've got the holes in, now I can put the stitching groove on the back side of the sheath. It's kind of difficult to line up the front to the back exactly, and I didn't want any of these holes to come through, kind of offset from where that groove is, so I figured it's probably easier just to drill the holes first and then put in the stitching groove. And then here I'm just using that marker tool, and really I'm just kind of pressing the edges of the holes in. As you drill them, they kind of flare up a little bit, so I'm just kind of squishing that in and kind of prying that back down so it's nice and smooth. Give yourself a really nice smooth surface so that our stitching will not be proud of the leather at all. And with all those holes drilled and our grooves nicely squished down, we can go ahead and finish up all the stitching on this sheath. And we'll finish it up on the backside by tying a couple of knots and then just trimming off those ends. Alright, with all the stitching done, now what we want to do is just take some sandpaper and rub it along the edges of the sheath, just to kind of get everything squared up, and then also to kind of remove any glue that may have squeezed out. I've got a belt grinder, so I'm going to go ahead and use it, but you can do this by hand as well. It just takes a little bit longer. Alright, so after sanding, a lot of times you kind of get the edges of the leather kind of flare out and these little thin wisps come off the whole edge. What we want to do is cut those off, and to do that I've got this special tool. It works pretty good, but you can also use just a regular X-Acto knife. Sometimes I like this tool, sometimes I just don't. So really we're just going to kind of basically put a light chamfer on there, and we want to keep it as even as possible, but it's not like you have to get super crazy. We don't want to go too deep. We basically just want to remove any thin little edges and just kind of get it all cleaned up. When you burnish it, it kind of levels that edge out, but we want all that thin leather to be gone. Alright, next I'm just going to clean up this leather real quickly before we go ahead and dye it. Now I'm just using a mixture of 50% water, 50% lemon juice. If you're in a clean environment, you may be able to skip this step, but since I'm working in my knife making shop, this leather kind of got a little bit dirty while I was working on it, so I'm just going to clean it up before we dye it. Now we're ready to dye our leather. I really like this gel antique. You can use whatever dye you'd like. This stuff is actually water-based, and I find it incredibly easy to work with. And from my experience, the name of the game is just saturate it like crazy. Obviously there's a lot of different finishes and styles you can finish leather off. If you just want a nice deep rich color, I find that this stuff works great if you just put it on really heavy and work it into the leather really well, and then I also let it dry quite thick and kind of wipe it off a little bit as it's drying. I even use a little brush to get into all the little nooks and crannies and the stitching holes, and really the name of the game is you just want this stuff on as thick as possible. Alright, now after that dye has dried, we can get ready to burnish the edges of the leather. This is the burnishing tool that I made. Basically, it's just a piece of wood doweling with some grooves that I cut into it, and then we're also going to use some beeswax. Incidentally, this is wax from our own bees, which is really cool. Alright, so all we're going to do is take some wax and put it on the edge of the leather, take our burnishing tool and rub it rigorously. Do this until you get a really nice smooth sheen and very nice even finish, switching between the flats and the grooves. My personal choice, I like to stick this burnishing tool in my metal lathe and run it that way. It makes super quick work of burnishing the edges of sheaths, but you know what, either way it produces fantastic results. And the last step of the process is just to put a clear coat of some sort. Make sure that it's compatible with the dye that you've used, follow the directions for it, and let her rip. Alright, so this part I should have done earlier. I've got this kind of edge dressing tool. I don't know exactly what you call it, but basically, again, it just kind of leaves puts a groove right in the edge of the leather. I'm going to run this along all the edges just to kind of accentuate them. It just gives a slightly more polished look, and really this should have been done beforehand. I kind of like this little thing, just dressing up the edges there, just gives it a slightly polished look while still keeping it very simple and not overly decorated. Alright, so there's the finished product. I'm happy with how it turned out. I think it looks pretty good. The knife that's going in it is actually one that I had made, and I auctioned it off on Instagram. A few days ago in my vlog, I made an earlier version of the sheath, but I forgot to put the welt in there, so I had to remake this one, and I thought, you know what, I may as well make a tutorial video while I'm doing it. Alright, well that's going to wrap it up for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. You know what, it'd be totally awesome if you learned something, and if you liked the video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, and thank you guys so much for watching. Cheers.